Have you ever been judged just because of how you look? Have you ever stood before someone who never met you, never even knew your name yet was convinced you were a threat? And can you imagine that in just 1 hour, all of those assumptions would completely reverse? This isn't just a story about a police officer in an old truck. This is a vivid lesson in arrogance and prejudice, and in the moment when a man who seemed ordinary made an entire system bow its head. In less than an hour, a sleek black SUV appeared. A man stepped out, and that officer, the one who once questioned with pride and looked down with certainty, had to take a step back, because the driver he had stopped earlier turned out to be anything but ordinary. It was a summer noon, nothing special in the small town of Wilmore in southern Georgia. The main road was quiet, filled only with the sound of cicadas and sunlight filtering through old roadside trees. An old faded Ford F-150 truck slowly pulled into a roadside gas station. Behind the wheel was a black man in his 60s wearing a faded shirt and a simple baseball cap. He wasn't in a hurry, didn't draw attention, but his presence accidentally caught a sharp, suspicious look from across the street. A young police officer around 30 years old sat in his patrol car checking his phone. He looked up, frowned, and within a minute the familiar red and blue lights flashed. Old license plate. Vehicle not up to code. Could be transient. Needs checking. No clear reason, just a feeling. And from that moment on, a series of events began. What seemed like a small mistake would become the biggest lesson of a man in uniform's life. Because sometimes the most intimidating power doesn't come from a badge or a gun. It comes from history, dignity, and the memory of a distant battlefield. To understand what really happened that day, we need to go back to the beginning, to where an old truck was stopped under the midday sun, and an officer began a routine check, one that would turn out to be deeply wrong. In Wilmore, a town where people still call each other by name, and every street carries the scent of old memories, summer afternoons often pass slowly, as if time stood still. Nothing special, nothing worth noticing. But that day, everything began with an old truck. A gray, patchy Ford F-150 slowly crossed the intersection and turned into a roadside gas station. The driver was an elderly black man wearing a wrinkled shirt, a baseball cap, and likely past 60. He hadn't done anything wrong, just driving. But across the road, the young officer, his name was Officer Travis Merton, had noticed him from the first second. He had no clear reason to stop the car, no stolen vehicle reports, no signs of violation. Yet he still turned on the red and blue lights. We call that a routine traffic stop. On the record, it would be logged as traffic stop for inspection. But if we're being honest, we'd have to call it something else, a personally motivated suspicion. When the old man rolled down his window, sunlight lit up his wrinkled face, but his eyes still shone. He wasn't scared, wasn't flustered. He simply asked gently, "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer looked at the car, looked at the man, and said something that didn't really make sense. "Your vehicle looks a bit worn down. I suspect it may not meet safety standards." That sentence at first may have sounded reasonable, but you know what? The way he said it, half mocking, half dismissive, revealed more than any justification ever could. Because if that truck had been a brand new Chevrolet Silverado and the driver had been a white man in a pressed shirt, would the stop have happened? It doesn't always make headlines. It lives in glances, in seemingly harmless questions, in the way someone thinks they have the right to ask without a reason. Every year, thousands of such stops happen across America. According to a study by Stanford, police officers are 40% more likely to stop black drivers than white drivers, even without clear violations. They call these pretext stops for a minor reason in hopes of finding something bigger. And that day in Wilmore, Officer Merton was doing exactly that. But what the officer didn't know, and what you're about to discover, is that the man in front of him wasn't just an old guy in a beat-up truck. He once commanded hundreds of soldiers. He once stepped into gunfire to save a young soldier, someone who just minutes later would drive a black SUV to this gas station. And in less than an hour, what we call power would completely shift hands. But before any of that happened, before the truth was revealed and the officer's perspective transformed, let's return to that moment. The moment when a black man took a deep breath and chose not to get angry, not to argue, but simply looked into the eyes of the one questioning him with the calmness of someone who had seen the worst the world could throw at him. You might be wondering, who was he, And why, despite everything, didn't he need to raise his voice to silence an entire town? He didn't say much. When asked for his documents, he didn't rush, didn't resist. He quietly reached into his worn coat pocket, pulled out an old leather wallet, and handed over his driver's license and registration through the window. No complaints, not even a furrowed brow. The officer took them momentarily surprised. Maybe he was used to people reacting, questioning, protesting, even getting angry. But this man just observed with a kind of gaze that made it impossible to read what he was thinking. He asked, "Is this your vehicle?" The man nodded. "You live around here?" Another nod. "So where are you headed?" That same skeptical tone, full of implications. But the man didn't respond right away. He turned and looked at the officer as if his eyes were scanning the man's mind. Then he spoke in a warm, low voice, calm and clear. "I'm going to get gas. And you? What are you looking for?" That question left the officer speechless. Not because the man shouted, not because he was confrontational, but because he didn't need to be. There's a certain kind of silence that's incredibly powerful. It's not weakness. It's the strength of someone who's seen far more than you could ever imagine. The man in the truck that day, though he didn't reveal who he was, though he didn't show off, still made people cautious. In psychology, this is called the calm assertiveness effect, being quietly powerful. It shows up in people who've been through so many trials that nothing can easily shake them. Veterans, survivors, people who've lived through danger and loss. They don't yell. They watch. They wait. And when they speak, the whole room listens. You might have heard of Desmond Doss, the famous W-Force American soldier portrayed in the film Hacksaw Ridge. He never carried a weapon, never fired a shot, just carried his faith and a medic's kit. But he saved 75 men in one night under a rain of bullets on a battlefield in Japan. Just like the man in the truck that day, Doss didn't need to shout to be great. He simply did the right thing, holding on to his calm like a lighthouse in a storm. Sometimes silence is the strongest answer. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you don't need to prove anything. Truth doesn't need to scream, it just needs to stand there. And the presence of that man with just a few words, a few looks, was enough to make the young officer begin to hesitate. But neither of them knew that just a few blocks away, a black SUV was leaving the gates of Fort Gadsden military base. Inside was a man in full dress uniform wearing 4 shining stars on his collar. He wasn't coming because of a cry for help. He wasn't responding to a siren. He was coming because of a debt he'd never repaid. There's something strange about us humans. We often decide whether someone is trustworthy or dangerous kind, or suspicious, within the first few seconds of meeting them. Just from a worn-out jacket, a haircut, a skin tone. We don't need to hear their story. We think we already know. When that young officer in Wilmore saw the old truck and the black man behind the wheel, his mind automatically filled in the blanks. Probably unemployed. Probably homeless. Maybe has a record. Better check thoroughly. Not one of those thoughts came from facts. They came from bias, the things we call experience, but are really scars left by environment and culture. Every small town has its own rhythm, a slow pace that makes any disruption feel big. And in Wilmore that day, change began with a familiar yet strange sound in that setting. It was the deep, smooth rumble of a vehicle approaching. Not a shopper's car, not a patrol vehicle. It was a sleek black SUV, tinted windows, military plates. Officer Travis looked up, squinting. For a few seconds, the air seemed to thicken. The SUV pulled in right behind the old Ford F-150. The door opened. A man stepped out. He didn't need to say a word, yet the entire atmosphere shifted. He was a tall black man, dressed in a perfectly pressed military dress uniform. On his collar, 4 shining stars caught the afternoon sun, a 4-star general. A small U.S. Army insignia and a simple nameplate Langston. There were no sirens, no shouting, only a solemn silence blanketing the air, as if the whole town instinctively knew something important was happening. In the military world, rank is sacred, and to rise to the level of a 4-star general, you need more than just accomplishments. You need intelligence, character, and the respect of thousands. This general didn't have to prove who he was. His presence, the SUV, the uniform, the look in his eyes did that already. Even Travis, though he had never met General Langston, instinctively straightened up one hand, moving close to his belt as if awaiting orders. In U.S. military leadership training, there's a story that's retold often. When General Colin Powell was still alive, he once walked into a meeting room at the Pentagon unannounced. There was no rule that required anyone to stand, but when he entered, everyone stood. Because they knew when someone who once led the entire U.S. military walks into the room, you don't stand for the title. You stand for the respect. And that day in Wilmore Travis, the man who believed he was in control suddenly felt small. There are people who don't need to raise their voices to be heard. They don't need to prove themselves to be respected. They only need to show up. And that comes from years of living with honor, courage, and unwavering loyalty to what's right. The general didn't walk straight to the officer. He circled around to the front of the old truck, leaned down by the driver's window, and smiled at the elderly man inside. A handshake. No words necessary. Just a look like two soldiers who had once shared the same trench. And then he turned back, locking eyes with Travis with the gaze of someone who knew better than anyone that respect doesn't come from a badge, but from the memories of those who've seen death up close. Because the man in the truck, the one Travis had doubted, questioned, and nearly humiliated, was the very one who had saved General Langston's life 35 years ago. In behavioral science, there's a term called implicit bias, unconscious prejudice. It's the beliefs we absorb throughout our lives, often shaped by movies, media, other people's stories, or even fleeting images we've seen. A famous study by Harvard University asked thousands of participants to complete a quick test, just a few minutes, to match faces with either positive or negative words. The result, the majority, including people of color, responded more negatively to images of Black individuals. Not because those people were bad, but because society had programmed them to think that way. Remember the story of Henry Louis Gates Jr., the renowned Harvard professor. He was arrested right at the door of his own house while trying to unlock it after a long trip. A neighbor called the police thinking a Black man was breaking in. That incident didn't just spark national outrage. It led to the famous beer summit at the White House, where President Obama, the professor, and the officer sat down together to learn how to truly listen to each other. Whenever we look at someone and jump to a conclusion, we should ask ourselves, am I seeing them with my own eyes? Or with what I've been taught to believe? Because we might be judging a soldier, a teacher, a doctor, just because they don't look the way we expect. And if a beat-up truck makes you think the driver is unworthy of respect, then the problem isn't the truck. But there are people who don't get trapped in prejudice. There are people who, even after reaching the heights of power, never forget who they were or who once saved them. And just minutes later, that man stepping out of the black SUV would force the young officer to reconsider everything he thought he knew about appearances. Because sometimes the person you think is a nobody is the very reason a whole nation remains free. General Morris Langston isn't a household name in Wilmore. He lives in Washington near the Pentagon and spent most of his life in service. But to those who've worn the uniform, who've stood on foreign soil with bullets flying overhead, his name means something. He once led the 75th Armored Brigade in Operation Desert Storm. He was a national security advisor to 3 presidents, and he was promoted to 4-star general after over 30 years of flawless service, one of the very few Black Americans to ever reach that rank in the U.S. Army. But that wasn't what brought him back to Wilmore today. What brought him here was a debt to the man sitting in that old truck. 35 years ago on a barren hill in Kirkuk, Iraq, Langston's unit was ambushed. A mortar shell landed nearby, flipping the Humvee he was in. He lay unconscious, his uniform soaked in blood. Everyone scattered, but one man ran toward the smoke. Someone without body armor, armed only with bandages and a prayer. That man, the one driving the old Ford truck today, dragged Langston out of the wreckage, treated his wounds, and carried him back to the nearest rally point through gunfire and chaos. His name was Raymond Carter. Not a general, not a senior officer, just a quiet combat medic sergeant. Raymond never told anyone that story. He didn't receive a medal. He never appeared on TV. He was discharged, quietly returned home, drove trucks for hire, and lived in a wooden house on the edge of the forest. Langston, on the other hand, rose through the ranks, and every time he looked at the stars on his shoulders, he remembered that night. And he made a promise to himself, if I ever get the chance to repay this debt, I will not hesitate. Because in this society, we often reserve our respect for titles. We bow to degrees, power, and status. But some people never needed medals or rank to deserve respect. They endure, they sacrifice, they give, and then are forgotten. Like Raymond Carter, the man who once saved a general's life, and then had to sit silently while being treated like a suspect just because of an old truck and the color of his skin. In 2016, a homeless veteran in Pennsylvania saved 3 children from a burning vehicle. He used to be in special forces, but after discharge, he lived in his car, begged for food, and went unnoticed. When the news broke, people weren't just shocked by what he did, they were shocked someone like him still existed, and they'd never seen him. Don't wait for someone to wear a uniform before giving them respect, because a truly kind human, a real hero, might look like anyone. When General Langston stood before Travis, he didn't bark orders. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said one sentence soft enough not to shame, but heavy enough to silence every thought in the officer's head. You just spoke to the man who saved my life and my career. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be wearing these stars. Travis didn't know how to react. That sentence didn't just extinguish his ego, it opened a door. A door into the past, into war zones, into the reason a man like Raymond Carter could return home and live as if he'd never existed. When the war ended, many soldiers came home to cheers and ticker tape parades. But not everyone was welcomed back as heroes. Raymond Carter stepped off a military plane on a cloudy September morning. There was no band, no reporters, just a discharge paper, an awkward handshake, and a stay healthy from a ranking officer he'd never met. He picked up his faded backpack, boarded a bus back to Wilmore, the town he left as an 18-year-old with a dream to serve his country. In Raymond's mind, he would come home to a stable job, maybe at a hospital or as a community nurse or an EMT. At the very least, with over 10 years of field experience and a Purple Heart, he believed he wouldn't have to start from zero. But the reality was that even zero felt out of reach. During interviews, recruiters glanced quickly at his file. Some paused at the words combat medic and hesitated. One asked, "Have you ever had PTSD?" Another said, "That's good experience, but we need formal medical credentials." Once someone even offered advice, "Why not try part-time security?" Raymond didn't get angry. He quietly folded his paperwork and left. From a man who once ran through bullets to save others, he became someone who pumped gas-loaded grocery trucks and sometimes had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying medication. Raymond wasn't alone. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, nearly 40,000 veterans are homeless across the country, and among them, Black veterans are twice as likely to be affected compared to their white counterparts. Many of them, like Raymond, once saved lives. But now they are left behind unrecognized and denied even a second chance. We remember heroes when they wear the uniform, but when they take it off, they vanish into the crowd. The true worth of a person isn't in their title or appearance. It's in the quiet things they've done, often witnessed only by history and their own conscience. And that's what made General Langston's arrival so powerful. Not because of the authority he carried, but because he was the only person in that town who still remembered who Raymond truly was. When he approached and placed a hand on the old veteran's shoulder, something changed, not in Raymond, but in Travis. For the first time in this entire encounter, the young officer's eyes showed uncertainty. Not because he had been scolded, but because he was beginning to realize he had just done something he couldn't undo. Travis, the young police officer, stood silently next to his patrol car. Just an hour earlier, he had stepped out with the confidence common among young men in uniform. He was the one in control, the one giving orders, the symbol of law in a small town. But now, just a few steps away, stood a 4-star general beside the man Travis had questioned, documented, and nearly humiliated. And suddenly, the silver badge on Travis's chest didn't feel as heavy anymore. It felt weightless, almost hollow. General Langston didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten or demand anyone to kneel. He simply stood there, his hand resting gently on Raymond's shoulder, and said to the officer 3 words: "He is a hero." That was all. But the weight of those words pressed down on every nerve in Travis's body. The officer looked up, his eyes meeting the general's. He wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, but his throat tightened. Travis used to believe that the uniform was everything, that wearing it meant you represented justice. But for the first time, he realized justice isn't in the clothes you wear. It's in how you treat people, especially the ones you think have no power. In society, there are two kinds of power. Formal power granted by titles, uniforms, badges, or obvious markers of being above. True power earned through respect, through lived experience, through deeds done even when no one was watching. Travis held formal power. But Raymond, with his years, his history, his quiet courage, was the man even a four-star general called Sir. In 2018, during a military conference, a young soldier hesitated, unsure who to salute first among a group of high-ranking officers. Someone in the group said, "Salute the man you want to become, not just the one with the highest rank." The soldier walked toward an old man in civilian clothes, sitting quietly at the end of the row. He was a Medal of Honor recipient. No one mentioned his name in the news, but everyone stood when he entered. Titles can be given, but respect must be earned through action, through kindness, and through how we treat those who have less than us. A uniform may silence a room, but only character can make people truly listen. Raymond didn't say anything. He simply nodded gently to the general, then looked at Travis. Not with anger, not demanding justice, just a look calm, forgiving, as if to say, "You're young. And I was once you, many years ago." And in that moment, Travis lowered his head. No one made him do it. There's no law that says you have to apologize. But sometimes, the greatest lessons come from the very people we once underestimated most. That evening, after everyone had gone, Travis sat alone in his patrol car. The streetlights still cast their golden glow on the gas station lot. And in the rearview mirror, the image of Raymond Carter, an old veteran driving a beat-up truck, remained imprinted in his mind like a haunting question. Why didn't I see it sooner? At the police academy, Travis had been taught many things. How to run license plates, how to respond to dangerous situations, how to stay calm in the face of attackers. But there was no class that taught him how to truly see a person. No page in the textbook that mentioned respect for those society tends to overlook. And certainly, no one taught him that a man in a faded shirt might be the reason a general still lives to wear his stars. In many states across the U.S., police training focuses heavily on law, tactics, and threat management. Only a very small portion, sometimes less than 5%, is dedicated to unconscious bias training, communication skills, and empathy. This creates a generation of officers who know how to confront, but not always how to listen, who know how to ask questions, but not when to stay silent, who know how to take control, but not how to give people back their humanity. In Dallas in 2020, a patrol officer stopped a black man simply because he was wearing a hoodie and walking through a residential area at night. When he realized the man was a doctor returning from a hospital shift, the officer apologized. But what stood out was that the next morning the officer returned, knocked on the man's door, and asked to speak with his family. Not because he had to, not because someone caught it on camera, but because he knew a lesson had come to him and he needed to carry it forward. That action went viral not because it was perfect, but because it was human. There are things that can't be taught with theory, that can't be graded, that can't be written into multiple choice exams. They only arrive when you're placed in the right moment. And when that happens, you have two choices: ignore it and move on as before, or stop, look deep inside yourself, and choose to walk differently from then on. Travis didn't return to apologize with words, not because he wasn't sorry, but because he understood some things can only be said through actions. 3 weeks later, during the first internal training session at the Wilmore Police Department, he stood in front of a group of younger officers and told the story of that day. He didn't hold anything back, and sitting in the front row, watching with a calm and forgiving gaze, was Raymond Carter. That Saturday afternoon, the small auditorium inside the Wilmore Police Station was packed. No one had been arrested. There was no trial. It was just a community meeting, something rare in this town where police and civilians usually didn't share the same room unless something bad had happened. At the podium, Travis stood in front of the microphone. He wasn't carrying a gun. He wasn't in uniform. Just a young man sharing his own story, his voice occasionally trembling with emotion. "I thought I knew how to do this job, but it turns out the first thing I needed to relearn was how to listen. And I learned that from someone I once doubted just because he looked different." Sitting in the front row, Raymond Carter had his arms folded across his chest. There was no judgment in his eyes, no resentment, only the quiet of someone who had grown used to injustice, but still held hope for change. After the meeting, there wasn't a standing ovation, no sudden shift in public opinion. But something small did happen. A black mother approached, shook Travis's hand, and whispered, "I hope my son gets to hear this story in school one day." A young man said, "I've never trusted the police, but today, I feel a little different." Raymond didn't need to say a word. His presence alone was proof of something this town had never quite seen, that a sincere conversation could rebuild bridges everyone thought had collapsed. In a polarized society like ours, we often get pulled into arguments instead of conversations. But sociological research shows face-to-face dialogue is still the most effective way to break down prejudice and build trust. A 2021 report from the Harvard Kennedy School stated, community police engagement programs can reduce perceived discrimination by up to 60%, but only when they involve authentic experience sharing, not just theory. In other words, truth and sincerity are still the most powerful medicines for trust. In 2019 in Stockton, California, Police Chief Eric Jones held a town hall after several high-profile incidents of racial profiling within the force. Instead of defending the department's image, he invited people who had been wrongfully treated to come share their stories, including a teenager who had been arrested simply for riding a bike without a light. The result, it wasn't just tears and handshakes. Stockton later became one of the first cities to mandate a course in humanized communication for all new police recruits. Sometimes healing doesn't come from laws. It comes from a person brave enough to sit down, listen, and speak honestly. We can't erase a flawed history, but we can rewrite the present one conversation at a time. That day after the sharing session, Raymond and Travis quietly left the auditorium together. No one said anything. No one needed to, because sometimes when real change begins, you don't need to shout. You just need to show up, stay patient, and choose to walk forward side by side. When Travis took off his uniform after that night shift, he wasn't just removing his gear. He was peeling away a layer he once thought defined him. The uniform had made him believe he had the right to judge, that as long as he followed procedure and law, he was doing enough. But after meeting Raymond Carter, and after feeling the weight of his community's gaze, not of admiration, but of awakening, he understood that knowing the law doesn't mean understanding people. We live in a world that easily gets fooled by titles, badges, medals, and job descriptions. It makes us believe that wearing a role automatically gives us the right to interpret, judge, and control others. But real power doesn't come from the clothes you wear. It comes from how you treat people when they have nothing left to protect themselves. In several advanced police academies in Canada and Northern Europe, there's a special training module now included in the official curriculum. It has no exam, no grades. It only has one requirement. You must spend 24 hours living as someone without a uniform. You cannot announce your title. You cannot use your authority. Just live as an ordinary citizen in the very community you patrol. The results, most officers said, that was the day I understood why people fear the police and why I need to make them feel safe, not silent. Sometimes you have to strip away every outer symbol to truly see the inner life of another person. Because justice isn't just courts and statutes. Justice is when a human being is heard before they are judged. And true understanding always begins with being quiet long enough to hear what isn't being said. Raymond Carter doesn't need a monument. He doesn't need to be on television. He just needs to be seen as he truly is, a man who gave without asking in return, a quiet hero who never needed applause. Travis, after everything, didn't need praise either. He just needed one thing, that every day he wore that badge, he would never forget what it felt like to be wrong and to commit himself to doing right. And maybe the greatest lesson from this story isn't about the police or the military or even about race. It's something much simpler. You don't need to look like someone to respect them. You just need enough courage to learn how to see them as human. Because when you begin to see others beyond their appearance, profession, or circumstance, that's when you rediscover the deepest part of your own humanity. If this story touched you, leave a comment. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment of being misjudged because of how you look? We want to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. That person was me. So you won't miss the stories that help you see the world in a new light. Because maybe the small thing you share today could be the big thing that wakes someone up tomorrow.